I had 6 blocks to go before the silver sedan stopped being a shadow and became a cage. My fingers fumbled in my apron pocket, counting the crinkled singles and heavy quarters, my shield against another month of late rent. The metal felt cold, biting into my skin like a warning I was too tired to heed. Around me, the city screamed with the low-frequency grind of the night shift, the hiss of bus brakes, the distant siren's wail, the crunch of frozen slush under my worn sneakers. Outside the Gilded Lotus, the Chicago wind didn't just howl, it hunted, slicing through my thin white shirt until my breath came out in ragged, crystalline puffs. I walked toward the mouth of the alleyway like I was stepping into my own grave. Jinwoo Choi sat in the back of the idling black SUV, his silhouette a jagged tear against the city's neon backdrop. He looked like he'd been forged in a furnace and cooled in ice. Sharp, high cheekbones, eyes like obsidian glass, and a pinstriped suit that cost more than the hospital bills currently drowning me. His hand rested on the leather door handle, the cuff of his shirt pushed back just enough to reveal the dark ink of a dragon's tail coiling around his forearm, a mark of a world I only saw in nightmares. His fingers didn't fidget, they waited, drumming a slow, rhythmic cadence against the armrest. He looked like a man watching a masterpiece. He wasn't. 10 minutes ago, he'd watched a man check the safety on a Glock and pull out behind my bus. The locker room at the Gilded Lotus wasn't just a place to change, it was the only place I felt human for 5 minutes a day. I'd been lacing my shoes, hidden behind the row of rusted metal lockers, when I heard the heavy thud of the back door and voices, low, guttural, speaking a dialect of Korean that sounded like stones grinding together. I froze, one lace halfway through a loop. Junyanian Hanjaya. Galmagizio Jabe. She's alone. Take her in the alley. My Korean was customer level at best, enough to ask if they wanted more kimchi or a refill on tea. But I caught the fragments. Gunyo, her. Galmag, alley. Jabe, catch/take. The words didn't sound like a conversation, they sounded like a harvest. 1 at the corner, 2 in the car. And then the tone shifted, a voice that sounded like heavy boots on gravel, switching to a jagged, consonant-heavy Russian. It was the sound of a blade being sharpened. I should have called the police, screamed, or run back into the safety of the kitchen. Instead, I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and listened. The weight of the tip jar money in my pockets suddenly felt like lead. Saigonai Dwaesio. The time has come. My breath caught. The air in the locker room, usually smelling of stale perfume and floor wax, suddenly felt arctic. The man on the other end of the line responded in that harsh, consonant-heavy Russian. I couldn't parse the words, but the intent was unmistakable. They weren't just following a waitress. They were setting a trap for a king, and I was the bait. The Gilded Lotus didn't just sell expensive food, it sold the illusion of peace for people who spent their lives at war. Table 4 was tucked into the far corner, a semi-private alcove where the lighting was dim and the air always felt 5 degrees cooler. It was Jinwoo Choi's table. To the rest of the staff, he was the ghost in pinstripes, the man who tipped in crisp $100 bills and spoke only in low, measured tones. To me, he was the only person in the room who didn't look through me like I was part of the furniture. I smoothed my white shirt, feeling the damp heat of the kitchen still clinging to my skin. My feet ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm that matched the bass of the lounge music. When I approached with his usual order, a single malt scotch, neat, and a glass of sparkling water with 3 slices of lime, I felt that familiar shift in the air. Jinwoo was on his phone, his thumb tracing the dark ink of the dragon's tail that peeked from beneath his pinstriped cuff, but his eyes were already on me. "You're late tonight, Kiana," he said. His voice was like velvet pulled over gravel. He didn't look at his watch. He didn't have to. "Double shift, Mr. Choi," I replied, my voice sounding thinner than I wanted. I set the glass down, my hand steadying against the edge of the mahogany table for just a fraction of a second. The university bills don't pay themselves. He didn't offer pity. Men like him didn't understand the concept. Instead, his gaze lingered on my face, searching for the fatigue I was trying to hide behind a layer of drugstore foundation. For a moment, it was just us, the waitress and the king, in a bubble of silent, strange understanding. But then, I saw it. The subtle tightening of his jaw. The way his hand, usually as still as a statue's, gripped the phone a little tighter. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the reflection in the darkened floor-to-ceiling window behind me. Beyond the glass, the city was a blur of rain and neon, but in the reflection, I could see the lobby. A man was standing by the mahogany coat check, wearing a nondescript gray jacket that looked too heavy for the season. He wasn't checking a coat. He wasn't waiting for a guest. He was watching me. Not with the hungry eyes of a lonely businessman, but with the cold, calculated stare of a butcher weighing a piece of meat. The scent hit the room, a metaphorical stench of rot that only another predator could pick up. Jinwoo's expression didn't change, but his aura did. The quiet regular was gone, replaced by something much sharper, much more dangerous. He took a slow sip of his scotch, his eyes never leaving the reflection of the man in the gray jacket. "The bus stop on 4th Street, Jinwoo said, his voice dropping to a frequency that barely carried past our table. "Do you still take the 11:15? "Every night," I whispered, a sudden chill prickling my skin that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of cardstock, sliding it across the white tablecloth toward me. It wasn't a bill this time. It was a matte black card with nothing but a gold-embossed phone number. "Don't count your tips tonight, Kiana. Keep your head up. And if you see a silver sedan, you don't run. You call this number." I looked at the card, then back at him. His intense expression was a wall I couldn't climb. He was looking at the man in the lobby again, and for the first time, I realized that Jinwoo Choi wasn't just my most generous customer. He was a man who knew exactly what the man in the gray jacket was capable of. Because he was capable of much, much worse. "Go back to the kitchen," he commanded softly, the authority in his voice absolute. "Stay there until I leave." As I turned away, the fear I'd been avoiding for weeks finally crystallized. I wasn't just a girl working a job. I was a target. And the only thing standing between me and the shadow in the silver sedan was the man at table 4, who looked like he was about to set the entire city on fire just to keep me in his sight. The cold didn't just bite, it consumed. As I stepped off the 11:15 bus, the wind off the lake sliced through my thin white shirt, making the fabric cling to my skin like a shroud. I clutched my bag to my chest, my fingers brushing the sharp corner of the black card Jinwoo had given me. I hadn't called the number. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the man in the lobby was just a late-night traveler and the silver sedan was just a coincidence of city traffic. But as I turned onto the narrow stretch of the 4th Street alley, a shortcut that usually saved me 10 minutes of shivering, the silence of the city became absolute. The hum of the bus faded, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of footsteps on frozen slush. Not my footsteps. I quickened my pace, my heart hammering a frantic, uneven beat against my ribs. Behind me, the low-frequency purr of an engine rumbled. Headlights cut through the darkness, casting my long, trembling shadow against the graffiti-stained brick. The silver sedan didn't pass. It slowed, the tires whispering against the wet concrete until it idled just 10 feet behind me. "Kiana." The voice was a jagged rasp, familiar from the lobby. I spun around, my back hitting a cold metal dumpster. The man in the gray jacket stepped out of the driver's side, his face half hidden by a cap. He didn't look like a customer anymore. He looked like a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. In his hand, something metallic glinted, a blade, or perhaps a heavy tactical pen. "You should have stayed at the restaurant," he said, stepping into the halo of a flickering yellow streetlight. Choi can't protect you out here. I reached for my pocket, my breath hitching in my throat, but my hands were shaking too hard to find the card, let alone a phone. My knees felt like water. I was a waitress, a student, a nobody. I wasn't meant for this world of shadows and steel. Step away from her. The voice didn't come from the sedan. It came from the mouth of the alley, where the darkness was deepest. The man in the gray jacket froze. We both watched as a figure emerged from the gloom. Jinwoo Choi walked with a terrifying, predatory grace, his pinstriped suit jacket unbuttoned, his silk tie fluttering in the freezing wind. He didn't look hurried. He didn't look scared. He looked bored. He held a phone to his ear, the screen's blue light reflecting in his obsidian eyes. He didn't even look at the stalker, his gaze was locked on mine, pinning me to the dumpster with the sheer weight of his intensity. Yes, Jinwoo said into the phone, his voice as calm as a winter morning. The alley behind 4th. There's a silver sedan and a piece of trash that needs to be removed. The stalker lunged, his arms swinging in a wide arc. I screamed, closing my eyes, but the sound of the impact wasn't what I expected. There was no grunt of pain from Jinwoo. Instead, there was the sickening thud of bone meeting bone and the clatter of metal hitting the pavement. When I opened my eyes, Jinwoo was standing exactly where he had been, though his hand was now wrapped around the stalker's throat, lifting the man nearly off his feet. The man's face was turning a deep, bruised purple, his legs kicking uselessly against the air. Jinwoo didn't even break his stride in the conversation. I want the vehicle crushed and the remains sent to the Iron Fang's front office in a backpack, Jinwoo continued into the phone, his thumb tracing the dragon tattoo on his forearm as he tightened his grip. Inform the lieutenant. We're moving the gift to the fortress tonight. Clean up in 3 minutes. He tossed the man aside like a broken toy. The stalker crumpled against a stack of wooden pallets, gasping for air, but he didn't try to get up. He knew it was over. Jinwoo finally tucked the phone into his pocket and stepped toward me. The air around him smelled of expensive tobacco and cold rain. He stopped inches away, his shadow falling over me like a heavy velvet cloak. He reached out, his gloved fingers tilting my chin up until I was forced to look into the dark fire of his eyes. I told you not to walk home alone, Kiana, he whispered, his voice vibrating in my chest. Now, you're coming with me. Your life as a waitress ended the moment he touched that door handle. I looked at his hand, the hand that had just ordered a man's erasure, and then at his face. He was a monster, a king, and my only savior. And as he led me toward the black SUV waiting at the end of the alley, I realized that shock he had promised the underworld was only just beginning. The SUV moved through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago like a silent, black predator, its tinted windows turning the neon-lit city into a series of blurred, gray ghosts. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive leather and the fading ozone of the storm. I sat huddled against the door, my fingers still trembling as I clutched the hem of my white waitress shirt. The fabric was damp and translucent, a stark contrast to the heavy, armored luxury of the vehicle. Beside me, Jinwoo was a silhouette of cold, unyielding power. He didn't speak, but his presence was a physical weight, a gravity that pulled everything, including my breath, toward him. We didn't head back to the vibrant lights of the loop. Instead, the car climbed into the hills, eventually stopping before a set of massive iron gates that looked like they belonged to a medieval castle rather than a modern residence. They swung open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a driveway lined with towering pines that hid the world away. At the end of the path sat the fortress, a monolith of glass, steel, and black marble that seemed to grow out of the very rock of the hillside. Out, Jinwoo commanded softly. The door was opened for me by a man in a tactical vest, his face a mask of professional indifference. I stepped onto the heated stone of the driveway, my legs still feeling like they were made of glass. Jinwoo walked beside me, not touching me, yet his proximity felt like a shield. As we entered the foyer, the scale of his world hit me like a physical blow. The ceilings were 40 feet high, the floors a polished obsidian that reflected the dim, recessed lighting. There were no family photos here, no warmth. It was a place built for war rooms and cold calculations. "You're shivering," Jinwoo noted. He didn't wait for a reply. He reached up and unbuttoned his pinstriped suit jacket, shedding the garment with a fluid motion. "Sit." He pointed to a minimalist velvet sofa that looked more like an art piece than furniture. I sank into it, the deep blue fabric swallowing me. He stepped closer and draped the heavy wool jacket over my shoulders. It was warm, carrying the heat of his body and the faint, intoxicating scent of sandalwood and tobacco. For a moment, the weight of it grounded me, the pinstripes acting as a borrowed armor. Then, he reached for his cuffs. I watched, mesmerized and terrified, as he rolled his sleeves up to his elbows. My breath hitched in my throat. I had seen the tip of the tail at the restaurant, but now, under the sharp lights of the fortress, the truth was laid bare. A massive, ink-black dragon coiled around his right forearm, its scales so detailed they looked like they might move with the flexing of his muscles. The head of the beast rested near his wrist, its eyes depicted with a frightening, crimson intensity. It wasn't just art, it was a map of violence. The dragon's claws were wrapped around a series of jagged, Korean characters, the names of those he had conquered or the code he lived by. Below the dragon, the skin was marred by faint, silver lines of old scar tissue that cut through the ink like lightning strikes. "You're looking at the mark of the Choi Syndicate," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet hall. He held his arm out, allowing me to see the raw power etched into his skin. "It means I don't just own the streets you walk on, Kiana. It means I am the one who keeps the other monsters from devouring them." I reached out, my fingers hovering just inches from the dragon's head. The tattoo was a symbol of the life I had just been thrust into, a world where beauty was a mask for brutality, and protection came at the price of one's soul. "The man in the alley, the silver sedan." I whispered, my voice finally finding its strength. "He had a mark too, didn't he?" Jinwoo's expression turned lethal, his obsidian eyes locking onto mine. "He had the mark of the Iron Fang. A scavenger's brand. They think they can use you to get to me. They think your life is a currency they can spend." He leaned in, his face inches from mine, the scent of him overwhelming my senses. "They're about to find out that I don't negotiate with scavengers. I erase them." As I looked from the terrifying beauty of the tattoo to the cold resolve in his eyes, I realized the truth. I wasn't just a waitress anymore. I was a piece on a chessboard I didn't understand, and the man holding the pinstripe jacket around my shoulders was the only player who could keep me from being taken. The fortress wasn't just a home, it was a sanctuary and a prison, and I was now its most precious inhabitant. The room was bathed in a clinical, sapphire light that made the obsidian floors of the fortress look like a deep, bottomless sea. This wasn't a living space, it was a nerve center. Bank after bank of monitors lined the walls, scrolling through lines of code and security feeds with a dizzying speed that made my head spin. In the center of the room sat a sleek, stainless steel table. On it lay the canvas backpack from the alley, looking pitifully ordinary against the high-tech surroundings. Jinwoo's lead enforcer, the serious, tattooed man I'd seen earlier, stood over a workstation, his fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard. He didn't look up as we entered. He simply tapped a final key, and a high-pitched chime echoed through the room. "It's decrypted, boss," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. Jinwoo led me to the table, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. It was a gesture that should have felt comforting, but here, surrounded by the machinery of a hidden war, it felt like being claimed by a king. He nodded toward the monitor. "Show her," Jinwoo commanded. I leaned in, my breath hitching. On the screen, a folder opened, revealing a digital gallery of my life. There were photos of me stepping off the bus. Photos of me locking my apartment door. There was even a grainy long-range shot of me through the window of the Gilded Lotus, laughing at a joke a coworker had made. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. I wasn't just being followed, I was being studied like an insect under a microscope. The enforcer reached into the physical backpack and pulled out a stack of papers, spreading them across the metal table. They had your full rotation, Kiana, he said, pointing to a printed spreadsheet. Every shift, every break, every route you take when the bus is late. They even knew which nights you stopped for groceries. But it was the last item that made the room go silent. It was a single sheet of heavy bond paper, tucked into a plastic sleeve. At the top, written in a sharp, jagged script that looked like it had been carved with a razor, were 3 names. 2 were names I didn't recognize, likely high-ranking members of Jinwoo's organization. But the first name, the one circled in thick, dried blood red, sent a jolt of pure ice through my veins. Kiana Williams. Beneath my name was a set of coordinates and a time stamp, tomorrow night, 11:45 p.m. The exact time I usually reached my front porch. A hit list, I whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the cooling fans. They weren't just following me. They were waiting for the order to finish it. The air in the room suddenly felt vacuum-sealed. I looked up at Jinwoo. The calm, pinstriped regular from table 4 was gone entirely. His jaw was set so tight I thought his teeth might shatter, and his obsidian eyes were burning with a cold, lethal fire. He reached out and picked up the paper, his thumb brushing over my name. The Iron Fang doesn't do their own scouting, Jinwoo said, his voice dropping to a frequency that made the floor vibrate. This is professional work. They hired a specialist to find a crack in my armor, and they decided you were it. He turned to his enforcer, his expression turning into a mask of pure, unadulterated command. Trace the GPS signature on that camera. I want the location of the safe house where this data was being synced. And find out who signed the contract for the specialist. Already on it, boss, the enforcer replied, his face turning back to the monitors. Jinwoo turned back to me, taking a step into my personal space. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain was stronger now, more intoxicating. He took the hit list and crumpled it in his fist, his gaze never leaving mine. They think they found a weakness, he said, his voice a dark, protective promise. They think because you wear a white shirt and count quarters, you're a target they can just delete. He leaned down, his forehead almost touching mine, the intensity of his presence overwhelming the fear. They are about to learn that you aren't my weakness, Kiana. You're the reason I'm going to burn their world to the ground. As I looked at the decrypted secrets of my life spread out on that cold metal table, I realized the girl who walked to the bus stop didn't exist anymore. I was a name in red, a variable in a Mafia war, and the only man who could keep me alive was currently planning a massacre in my name. The silence that followed the revelation of the hit list was heavier than the stone walls of the fortress. Jinwoo led me away from the blue glow of the surveillance room and into a private study where the walls were lined with ancient leather-bound books and the air smelled of aged cedar. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass but didn't drink. He simply held it, the dragon on his arm seemingly tensing in the firelight from the hearth. I have a plane fueled and ready at O'Hare, he said, his voice devoid of its usual melodic lilt. It was flat, clinical. There is a house in a coastal village in Jeju. It's registered to a shell company that has no ties to the Choi name. You could be there by tomorrow evening. I will provide a monthly stipend that exceeds your annual salary 10 times over. You would be safe. You would be anonymous. You would be free. I looked down at my hands. They were still stained with the faint gray ink of the Gilded Lotus receipts, the mark of a life spent serving people who never looked me in the eye. The thought of a quiet village was a siren song, a dream of safety I had craved every time I walked down that dark alley. And the Iron Fang? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The men who put my name in red? What happens to them? Jinwoo finally took a sip of the scotch, his obsidian eyes tracking the movement of the flames. I will deal with them. But as long as you are a civilian, you will always be a target they can use to hurt me. If you leave, you remain a victim who got lucky. You will spend the rest of your life wondering if every silver sedan you see is the one that finally caught up. He set the glass down with a definitive clack and walked toward me, stopping just short of touching me. The heat radiating from him was a physical force. There is another way, he murmured, his gaze dropping to the white collar of my waitress shirt, the uniform of my invisibility. You stay. Not as a guest, not as a victim, but as part of this house. I don't just mean protection, Kiana. I mean I give you the teeth to bite back. I teach you how to see them before they see you. I trade that white shirt for a suit of armor. I looked at the dragon on his arm, coiling toward his hand, a symbol of a man who had decided he would never be prey again. I thought about the bus rides, the counting of quarters, the paralyzing fear in the alley, and the way the world treated girls like me as if we were disposable. If I go to Jeju, I said, looking up into the dark fire of his eyes, I'm still the girl from the alley. Just in a prettier cage. Yes, Jinwoo admitted, his honesty cutting through the air like a blade. And if I stay? A slow, predatory smile touched his lips, the first I had ever seen. If you stay, you become the fire they weren't expecting. You become mine, and in this city, that makes you untouchable. I reached up, my fingers trembling only slightly as I began to undo the top button of my waitress shirt. It was the only power I had in that moment, the power to shed the skin of the person I used to be. I pulled the black card he had given me earlier from my pocket and dropped it into the wastebasket. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder, Jinwoo, I said, my voice hardening with a resolve I didn't know I possessed. Keep your plane. Teach me how to make them regret they ever learned my name. Jinwoo reached out, his large hand cupping the side of my neck, his thumb grazing my jawline. The touch was possessive, a silent vow. The dragon doesn't just protect its hoard, Kiana. It consumes anyone who tries to touch it. Welcome to the family. That night, the white shirt was burned in the hearth. In its place, laid out on the silk sheets of my new quarters, was a tailored suit of charcoal silk and a small, weighted pendant in the shape of a dragon's claw. I wasn't a waitress anymore. I was a variable no one had accounted for, and I was finally ready to stop running. The training didn't happen in a gym with bright lights and mats. It happened in the dead of night, within the sprawling, echoing corridors of the fortress and the rain-slicked labyrinth of the estate's private grounds. Jinwoo didn't treat me like a student. He treated me like a weapon that had been left to rust in a kitchen drawer, one that he was now grinding back to a lethal edge. Fear is a luxury you can no longer afford, Kiana, he murmured, his voice ghosting over my shoulder as we stood in the darkened observation room. From now on, you don't look at the world. You dissect it. He pointed to a screen showing a crowded street corner downtown. Tell me who is out of place. I squinted at the grain, my eyes burning. The woman with the red bag? No. She's too hurried. Look at the man in the navy windbreaker. He's checked his watch 3 times in 60 seconds, but he hasn't moved an inch. He's not waiting for a bus, he's waiting for a signal. Jinwoo stepped closer, his chest grazing my back, his heat a constant reminder of the life pulse beneath the pinstripes. That is a tale. He wants to look invisible, but by trying too hard to be nothing, he becomes everything. For hours, he drilled the mechanics of the shadow world into my mind. He taught me the 3-point check, how to use shop windows, rearview mirrors, and even the reflection in a phone screen to scan behind me without ever turning my head. He taught me to count exits before I counted my change and to identify the alpha in every room before I reached for a chair. But the most chilling lesson wasn't about spotting the enemy. It was about becoming the person the enemy wanted to see. They want you to be a waitress, Jinwoo said, walking a slow circle around me. He had traded his suit jacket for a black tactical shirt that clung to his frame, the dragon on his arm looking ready to strike in the low light. They want the girl who cowers in alleys and shakes when a man raises his voice. They want the white shirt. He stopped in front of me, his gaze dropping to the charcoal silk suit I now wore. Use it. Your vulnerability is the greatest trap you possess. When they see a girl in shock, they see an opening. They get sloppy. They lean in too close. He reached out, his hand wrapping around my throat, not to squeeze, but to simulate the grip of a captor. His thumb rested against my pulse, which was no longer a frantic flutter, but a steady, cold thrum. When they think they've won, that's when you take their eyes. That's when you find the soft tissue under the jaw. You don't fight like a soldier, Kiana. You fight like a secret. He handed me a small, weighted object, a tactical stylus disguised as an expensive fountain pen. If they take you, let them. Let them feel powerful. Let them think you're crying. And when they reach for you. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I felt the weight of the steel in my hand and the weight of his expectations in my soul. I practiced the move 100 times, the feigned stumble, the sob that masked a reach for the hidden blade, the wide-eyed look of terror that preceded a lethal strike to the temple. By the time the moon began to sink behind the pines, I didn't recognize the reflection in the glass. The girl who counted quarters was gone. In her place was someone who knew how to turn a silver sedan into a hearse. You're ready for the next step, Jinwoo whispered, his hand sliding from my throat to cup my cheek. His eyes, usually so cold, held a flicker of something that felt like dark pride. Tomorrow, we give the Iron Fang exactly what they want. We give them the girl. I leaned into his touch, no longer pulled by gravity, but by the shared darkness between us. And then, he said, his voice a promise of the carnage to come, we show them why you're the last thing they'll ever see. The plan was set in motion at 10:45 p.m., exactly 1 week after the silver sedan first marked me for death. I stood on the corner of 4th Street, the streetlights flickering overhead with a dying, yellow hum. To any observer, I was Kiana Williams, the vulnerable waitress in a thin jacket, looking over her shoulder with the practiced twitch of the haunted. But beneath the facade, my pulse was a steady, rhythmic drum. I wasn't waiting for the bus. I was waiting for the wolves. Back at the fortress, I knew Jinwoo was watching. He sat in the sapphire glow of the command center, his eyes fixed on the high-definition feed from my hidden button camera and the surrounding street monitors. He had personally leaked the breach, in his security, a faked logistics report suggesting I was being moved to a safe house without an escort. The air smelled of impending snow and exhaust. Then, I saw it. The silver sedan slowed at the intersection, its headlights cut to dim parking lights. My stomach did a single, sharp flip, not of fear, but of anticipation. I moved toward the alley, my footsteps sounding heavy and uncertain on the pavement. I was the bait, and the trap was gaping wide. Inside the command center, Jinwoo's expression was carved from the darkest obsidian. He watched the screen as 3 men in tactical gear emerged from the sedan, their movements swift and silent. His hand gripped the armrest of his chair so tightly the leather groaned, the dragon on his forearm appearing to writhe in the shifting blue light. He wasn't just watching a kidnapping, he was watching the underworld commit the last mistake they would ever make. Target in sight, a voice crackled over Jinwoo's comms. They're moving in. Jinwoo didn't blink. His jaw was a jagged line of suppressed violence. He watched as the men cornered me against the brick wall of the alley. On his monitor, he saw me play the part perfectly. My hands flew up to cover my mouth, my shoulders shook, and I let out a sharp, muffled sob as a heavy hand clamped over my face. Stay calm, Kiana, Jinwoo whispered to the empty room, his voice a lethal vibration. Let them take you. On the screen, a black cloth was thrown over my head, and I was hoisted into the back of the sedan. The doors slammed shut, and the car sped away, disappearing into the labyrinth of the city. To the Iron Fang, they had just secured the ultimate leverage over the Choi syndicate. To Jinwoo, they had just invited a Trojan horse into their sanctuary. Jinwoo stood up, his pinstriped suit jacket abandoned on the floor, leaving him in a black tactical shirt that showcased the full, terrifying expanse of his ink. He turned to his lead enforcer, who was already tracking the sedan's embedded GPS signature, a signature they didn't know was broadcasting from the very lining of my jacket. "Do we have the location?" Jinwoo asked, his voice dropping to a frequency that made the monitors tremble. "The old meatpacking district, boss. Warehouse 12. The Iron Fang leadership is already converging there to celebrate the catch." Jinwoo reached for a heavy, matte black handgun on the table, checking the magazine with a cold, mechanical click. The Waitress was gone, and the Obsidian Queen was currently sitting in the back of their car, counting their heartbeats. He looked at the final freeze frame of the kidnapping on the main screen, the image of my terrified face just before the hood went on. A ghost of a smile, dark and devoid of mercy, touched his lips. The Iron Fang thought they had found his weakness. They were about to find out that he had simply given them a front-row seat to their own execution. "Tell the strike team to hold until I arrive," Jinwoo commanded, walking toward the exit with the grace of a god of war. "I want to be the one to show them exactly what happens when they touch what belongs to the dragon." The warehouse smelled of stagnant river water and industrial grease, a cavernous tomb of rusted iron and rotting timber in the heart of the meatpacking district. I sat in a splintered wooden chair in the center of a makeshift ring of industrial floodlights, my hands bound behind my back with heavy zip ties. The black hood had been ripped from my head moments ago, the sudden glare of the lights forcing my eyes to squint. I didn't fight it. I let my head hang, my shoulders trembling in a way that looked like terror but was actually the calibrated focus of a predator waiting for the kill signal. Around me, the leadership of the Iron Fang syndicate had gathered like vultures. 5 men in expensive leather jackets and heavy gold chains stood just outside the circle of light, their faces twisted into masks of arrogant triumph. In the center stood their boss, a man with a jagged scar running from his ear to his chin, holding a glass of cheap whiskey as if it were the finest champagne in the city. "Look at her," the scarred man sneered, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls. "Choi's precious little ghost. He's been tearing the city apart for a week to hide her, and we plucked her off the street like a stray kitten." He stepped into my space, the scent of tobacco and fermented grain rolling off him. He reached down, grabbing a handful of my hair to tilt my face upward. "You're the leverage that breaks his empire, Kiana. By morning, Jinwoo Choi will be signing over his docs and his pride just to keep your heart beating. Do you understand how much you're worth?" I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I looked him dead in the eye, that vulnerability he expected melting away to reveal the cold, obsidian stare Jinwoo had forged in the dark. "I know exactly what I'm worth," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors I'd been faking for the last hour. "I'm worth more than all of you combined. But you've made one mistake." The scarred man laughed, glancing back at his lieutenants. "A mistake? And what would that be, little girl?" "You didn't check the lining of the jacket," I whispered. At that exact moment, the tiny haptic transmitter sewn into the hem of my charcoal silk suit pulsed twice against my skin. The signal had been received. The beacon was live. "You didn't capture me," I continued, a dark, predatory smile touching my lips. "I brought the dragon to your front door." A split second later, the massive skylights above the warehouse shattered in a rain of jagged glass. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of silenced submachine guns replaced the sound of the wind, and the red laser sights of Jinwoo's strike team began dancing across the chests of the Iron Fang soldiers like lethal fireflies. The scarred man spun around, his whiskey glass shattering on the floor. "What?" Before he could reach for his weapon, the heavy steel doors at the far end of the warehouse were blown off their hinges with a deafening roar. Out of the smoke and fire stepped Jinwoo Choi. He wasn't wearing his pinstriped jacket. He was in his black tactical gear, the dragon on his arm fully visible and seemingly alive in the flickering emergency lights. He moved with a terrifying, calculated grace, a handgun in each hand, clearing the room with surgical precision. I didn't wait for him to reach me. I leaned forward, using the leverage of my weight to snap the cheap plastic zip ties against the sharp metal edge of the chair's frame, a trick I had practiced until my wrists bled. My hands came free. In one fluid motion, I reached into the hidden pocket of my trousers and pulled out the tactical stylus. The man with the scar turned back to me, his eyes wide with the sudden realization that the prey had teeth. He lunged, but I was faster. I dropped low, feigning a stumble, and as he reached for my throat, I drove the steel point into the soft tissue beneath his jaw, just as Jinwoo had taught me. He collapsed, gurgling, as Jinwoo reached the center of the circle. Jinwoo didn't look at the bodies falling around him. He looked only at me, his obsidian eyes burning with a pride so dark it felt like a caress. He offered me his hand, his thumb brushing over the dragon tattoo. "You're late," I breathed, taking his hand and standing over the ruins of the iron fang. "I had to make sure they were all in the room," Jinwoo replied, his voice a low, protective rumble. "The trap is closed, Kiana. The underworld is watching. Now, let's show them the end of the show." The smoke in the warehouse had barely cleared before the underworld began to reshape itself around the void left by the iron fang. By morning, the silver sedan was a cube of crushed scrap metal, and the names in red had been systematically erased from every ledger in the city. The message had been sent, signed in blood and delivered with the cold, surgical precision of the Choi syndicate. Kiana Williams was no longer a variable. She was the constant. 3 days later, the Chicago winter seemed to lose its teeth. The wind still howled against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Gilded Lotus, but from the inside, the world looked different. I wasn't standing in the humid chaos of the kitchen, lacing up worn sneakers and bracing for a double shift. I wasn't counting quarters or flinching at the sound of heavy boots. I arrived at the restaurant just as the dinner rush began to hum with its usual frequency of wealth and whispered secrets. I wore the charcoal silk suit, the fabric moving against my skin with a soft, expensive hiss. I didn't enter through the back door. I walked through the front, the maitre d' bowing so low his forehead nearly brushed the mahogany podium. I walked past the locker room where I had once hidden in terror, past the service stations where I had spent years being invisible. My eyes didn't drop to the floor. I scanned the room with the 3-point check Jinwoo had taught me, identifying the exits, the security, and the predators before I even reached the back alcove. Table 4 was waiting. Jinwoo was already there, looking like he'd been carved from the very obsidian that lined his fortress. He was on a call, his voice a low, melodic rumble, his thumb tracing the dragon tattoo on his forearm. When he saw me, he didn't smile, men like him rarely did, but the intensity in his eyes flared, a dark fire that recognized its match. He stood, pulling out the chair beside him. Not across from him. Beside him. "You're on time, Kiana," he said, the velvet over gravel tone of his voice vibrating in the air between us. "I don't have a bus to catch anymore," I replied, sliding into the seat. I looked out at the city glittering behind the glass wall. From this height, Chicago looked like a throne of lights, a sprawling empire of glass and steel. For the first time in my 24 years, the shadows didn't look like places where monsters hid. They looked like territory. Jinwoo signaled to the waiter, a young man in a white shirt whose hands shook just a fraction as he set down 2 glasses of scotch. I recognized that shake. I recognized the way he kept his head down, trying to be part of the furniture. I reached out, my fingers brushing the heavy gold-embossed dragon claw pendant at my throat, and for a fleeting second, I felt a ghost of sympathy. But it was gone as quickly as the steam off a kitchen line. "The Iron Fang territories have been absorbed," Jinwoo murmured, leaning in close until the scent of sandalwood and cold rain enveloped me. "The board of directors has accepted the restructuring. There will be no more silver sedans, Kiana. Not for you. I know, I said, taking a sip of the amber liquid. It burned, but it was a clean, sharp heat, the kind of heat you only feel when you've walked through the fire and come out with the flame in your hand. I looked at the dragon on his arm, then down at my own steady hands. I had traded my invisibility for a crown of thorns, and my safety for a seat at a table where every meal was a negotiation with death. But as Jinwoo's hand covered mine, his grip possessive, protective, and absolute, I realized I had never been more alive. The waitress who counted quarters was buried in the rubble of Warehouse 12. The woman sitting at table 4 was something the underworld wasn't prepared for. Together, we watched the city breathe, two predators perched above a world that finally knew better than to look us in the eye. The shadows weren't following me home anymore. They were waiting for my command.